All right, so here we are today on this fine day, and I am here with Mr. Donald Lindsay, and I'm very excited to present this interview because I have come to know Donald a little bit the last 2 years as my bagpiping teacher, and through that time, I have been able to learn so much from him. He's been a source of great wealth of information about bagpiping, and it's been truly an honor. And the more that I've talked with him, I said, we have to get this out online so that people can also enjoy a lot of the information that he has, because he has had such an amazing life with bagpiping. I mean, I'm going to link over here so that the viewers can read, and I would strongly encourage them to read this interview that you did with The Voice, because you had such a colorful life with your experiences, like learning the bagpiping and with your school in Vermont, your interactions with other bagpipers, just how you got introduced with bagpiping, especially the journey that you went on with your dad. It's such a beautiful story. So I would strongly encourage everyone, if they're not aware of who you are, to read this interview before we start this interview, which I'm sure is going to be fantastic, because again, you have such great info that I really wanted people to enjoy this this interview that you're about to conduct with me, that we're so fortunate to have you do.
Thank you for that, Chris. I'm so glad that you are thinking about trying to capture some of the experiences that pipers have been having and put it somewhere, hopefully, where it won't just disappear from the face of the earth, as so many things do. So I'm delighted. Anything I can do to respond to your questions, I'll be glad to do.
Thank you, Donald. So yeah, it's funny because sometimes when we're doing a lesson together, you'll ask me like, well, what do you want to work on today? And to be quite frank, I'm sometimes like, I'm just fine with just talking to you, because you have such great info, and that alone is worth so much, because it's just great being around someone who's as passionate about bagpiping as you are, and who has had so much history. So speaking of history, I figured, for the sake of kind of keeping things in chronological order, I figured we'd kind of go back in time to some of the earlier beginnings of bagpiping. So I was curious if you could tell us about where bagpipe music originated from, or I guess more so, it could even just be about more so with Highland bagpiping, because obviously there are many types of bagpiping. There's many types of bagpipes in different countries like France and Italy, I believe in Greece as well. And some people have said that bagpipes might have come back from Egypt. But I think, just to kind of keep things more focused, can you maybe comment about where I guess Highland piping sort of originated from, or what that might have been like in its earliest roots?
Well, I have to begin by talking about an area that I wish I had more profound knowledge. And that area would be the early groupings of people together as clans. And I just feel that the nature of the clans is very much like the nature of many, many indigenous people around the world. People group together for mutual support. And the environment of the Highlands of Scotland presented lots of extremes of weather. It presented lots of extreme difficulties in obtaining food. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of competition for land, for the rights to land, and for the ability to supply families with their needs. And that followed then that there was clan warfare. not unlike something that's closer to home, the long history of the indigenous people of North America, where they indeed grouped together and worked together to survive. And inevitably, there were conflicts. The culture of the clan, as I understand it, is that there was specialization within the clan. Some people were particularly good at hunting and supplying food. Some people were particularly good at making clothing. Others were very good in building shelters. To my understanding, there was little or no reading or writing in the ancient times, not in the sense that we have now. And so the idea of having a history was important. And so that led to the importance of bards, who kept, as I understand it, a long, long oral history of the families that lived together, their highlights and downlights, times when they accomplished things which made them very, very pleased and proud, and times when they went through incredible hardships. I'm led to believe that some of the bards eventually began to use harps to accompany their bardic poetry. And my sense of the bardic poetry is that it's along the lines of what we can read in the Iliad and the Odyssey, praising the great achievements of the leaders of the clan and describing some of the obstacles that they had to deal with. And it's my understanding that the bards were present when there were skirmishes and battles, and that part of their function, as I understand it, was to encourage the warriors in the midst of the battles. There's a lot of lore that comes to us about this. There were magic banners and magic flags that were only unfurled in the most crucial times. They were believed, they were objects which clans people believed were magical. And one such example of this is the fairy flag at Dunvegan Castle, which they still have this framed. It's a huge banner, and it's of course now fragmented. It's in fragments, but there are even songs, Gaelic songs, about going to, for example, one of the many battles of Inverlochy in 1427. And by then, I'm skipped a step. The bagpipes eventually came into the scene, and the harp was not penetrating enough in the din of battle to be heard. So as the clanspeople began to put together a bagpipe, it had tremendous carrying power. Most likely, at some point, I can only assume that people just played what we now call the chanter, or some form of that, and formed some sort of a reed, and they could play melodies on it. And at some point, people wanted to sustain the sound for long periods of time. And that's when the addition of a skin reservoir of air and a blowpipe came onto the scene, presumably. as and then to have a melodic background, probably first one drone and then two, and then more recently the bass drone, until there was a constant drone quality going on in the background against the melody. So there's lots of speculation that forms of bagpipe migrated from ancient civilizations across Europe and arrived in Scotland. Again, I'm not an expert in that area, and so I don't really know exactly what might have happened there. But what I do believe is that the bagpipe became the voice of the clans, and the pipers were cast in a role which was an extension of the bardic role.
Okay.
So their function was to compose music that echoed the history of the clan and the important contributors to the clan history, as I said earlier, of great celebrations and horrific losses and sadness, all mixed up in the repertoire. And so the pipe definitely began to be played, as far as historians can tell us, at skirmishes and battles of all sorts. And so it became the voice of the Highland people. What went along with that was the tradition of Gaelic song, to my knowledge, goes very far back in time, to the earliest times. And so the bagpipe scale imitated the intervals and scale that was used by the singers.
Okay.
And so we end up with a unique scale that was developed long before the tempered scale. And one of the intervals that makes it somewhat special is that the seventh degree of the scale, our high G, is not a G sharp, but a G flat, or a G natural rather. And that gives part of the sound characteristic of the pipes. So this goes further, because not only was the instrument important in the full life cycle of the Highlanders, but they began to take an interest in perfecting the skill of the players. And the MacLeods of Dunvegan, I should also mention that the clans had septs. Septs were families that joined the clans, so that they were like federations.
Okay.
And we have that concept in North America when we find out about the American Indians and Canadian and American and South American. I mean, all through the Americas, there have been groupings that are, I believe, similar. So by the time we get to about 1500, the bagpipe is pretty strongly a part of Highland culture. And this is an important point, that it's wedded to the history of the Highlands. It's not a random or casual connection. It actually spoke for the history of the Highlands. And this is, again, before the majority of people could read or write.
Right.
So now we're talking about a tradition that's being carried around from person to person with their voice and on the bagpipe. And so, as we understand it, the main vehicle of transmitting the music from one person to another was to sing the music. One person would sing it to another person, and they would learn it that way. And so that's the whole business of counterach, which is, it means essentially to sing or chant. and you sing a tune or chant it. And even to this day, even in 2021, most of the devoted pipers of piping music will resort to counterog when they want to get into the more subtle aspects of the music. So they'll use it in their teaching. Now, they'll make up their own counterog, the sounds that they want to use. But there are formal languages that have survived, and one of those is the Campbell counterog. And that's been more or less decoded in the early 1900s by Sheriff Grant of Rothiemurchus. He sat down, studied the manuscripts, and saw that there's a pattern, and certain syllables mean certain notes, and certain changes in the syllables mean the addition of embellishments to those notes. So the early times, the bagpipe certainly made its way into the clans, was embraced by the clans, became their voice. And it's from those times that the early music, body of early music of piping emerged and became as carefully transmitted as is humanly possible to the present day.
Right, right. And would you say that the majority of the music back then was in the form of pibroch?
That's my understanding. That is my understanding, that was considered to be the heart and soul of it all.
Okay.
And I presume that they had music for dancing. So I'm only guessing that they must have had jigs and reels, for example. But I know that, for example, jigs were considered to be a private exercise that one would never play in public. Their function was to keep the fingers in good order.
Okay, so it's more of an exercise.
It's considered a kind of a private exercise, not really something you would play in public.
Okay.
That in public, it was more, my understanding, it was more about pibroch being played.
Okay.
And that changed as the history of the Highlands took a big turn after the 1745 rebellion, and the efforts made by the British government to dismantle the clan system. Pipers were risking their lives to play the bagpipe at that time, because the British government had declared that the instrument was an instrument of war.
Right.
So playing a bagpipe would be tantamount to shooting a rifle after a protracted war, and so the subject would be hung. That was the punishment. That also the Highland people were supposedly forbidden to speak Gaelic or wear the kilt.
So obviously this must have had a very devastating effect upon the culture, being that the bagpipe was, as you said before, it was the voice of the clans people. And especially too with the, not even allowing people to speak a language, it must have obviously had a very devastating effect.
It had a profound effect. The Highland people were kind of known for their moxie. They were known for their spirit and commitment to what their beliefs. And so in various ways, a lot of this went underground. They loved, when they were together in a social or situation or a celebratory situation, dancing was a part of that. And music was a part of dancing. And if they couldn't play a bagpipe, they would sing the tunes. And so we have many tunes that might have been played on the pipe that are also sung. And that aspect of Gaelic music is post avil, which means the music of the mouth. It means that they're singing it instead of playing it on a fiddle or a harp or a bagpipe. So there's a lot of that. And so that was one way that the Highlanders got around the threat of execution for playing music. And but yes, it is the classic method for dismantling a culture, is to forbid the children to speak the language. And so that part of the story is a sad part of the story, and that's the same thing that happened to Indigenous people in Canada and Indigenous people in the United States. The children were removed forcefully from the families and put in various institutions. Canada, they were called residence schools. Scotland, they were called boarding schools. And they tried to basically remove all elements of their identity from the children by not allowing them to speak their language and not allowing them to really participate in anything that they had in common with their parents, which was a dark, dark chapter,
of course,
for the Canadian folk. Canada is still reeling from the effects of that. And it's been a dark chapter for Indigenous people in the United States. And it was absolutely a dark chapter for Irish and Scottish people as well. And that's very, very brutal. But it goes on today in different parts of the world. And it's that whole thing of whoever wins the battles determines the history.
Right.
So the Scottish people and Irish people have been through the mill on that. And that led to a lot of immigration to North America and Australia and New Zealand and various parts of Europe, just to get out from under that. But piping, you don't have to go down through many indexes in pipe music books to see all sorts of history appearing in the names of the tunes. Of course, 1745 was a big turning point, and that's when pipers who wanted to continue playing the pipes were offered the option of playing in the Highland regiments. And so a lot of pipers did at that time join the Highland regiments. And then that begins a major chapter of piping history when light music really came to the fore, marches, particularly marches. And so pipers were faced with the task of, well, if all you've ever played is pibroch, how are you going to march to that? And so lots of times they did such things as take a pibroch and turn it into a march.
Okay.
One of the great examples of that is the pibroch of Donald Dew.
Okay.
And we know that now as frequently as a 6/8, a very bright, cheerful 6/8 march. But initially it was a tune to build the spirits of clansmen who were about to engage in a battle. And so the pibroch is beautiful and the march is beloved. And so this led to the development of what we used to refer to as quick step marches, meaning that they were in various time signatures. Mostly they were in 2/4 or 6/8 time. And the whole point was to lift the spirits of soldiers in transit. So they were famous for 40 miles marches and 40 pounds on their back and one or two pipers at the head of a column. My first teacher did that. He was in France in the First World War, and he led columns of men. There were always usually two pipers at the front of the columns, and they would spell one
Which
another.
teacher was this, their name?
That was William Morley, Bill Morley,
Okay,
and he lived in Morristown, New Jersey. He was originally from around about Dumfries. He and his wife was Rabina, and they emigrated. I'm not sure exactly when they emigrated, but I'm guessing it was probably after the Second World War that they emigrated.
okay.
And
Do you know the name of the outfit that he was with?
yes, he was with the Argyll Sutherland Highlanders.
Okay.
His father was a pipe major in the Argylls, and he had, I don't know how many brothers, but two or more brothers, all played the pipes. They all played in that Argyll's pipe band, and their dad was the pipe major.
So would you say before this transition to where the Highlanders were joining the military and playing quick steps and this new form of music, martial music, would you say before then it was predominantly just pibroch that would be used to rouse the troops?
Absolutely, that's my
Okay.
understanding. And there are some of the ancient tunes are in the Gaelic word in the title is speastrach, which means march.
Mm-hmm.
But it was march in the sense of martial,
Right,
warlike.
right. Like from
That's
the god
the
Mars.
use of the
even.
word march. It wasn't left, right, left, right, left. It
Right,
was like, this
right.
is a war tune. We're going to
Right.
war. Yeah.
So since we're on that subject, can you describe like what maybe a battle in say the 1600s might have been like? There was perhaps a controversy and there was about to be a battle, and the pipers were then called to kind of signal to people. What might have that been like back then?
Well, I can speculate because I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but I do recall that one of the most significant battles in the history of Scotland was the Battle of Culloden in 1745. And this was a major effort on the part of the Scots and Irish and even French. There were many countries besides just the Highlanders involved in this. A lot of volunteers from Europe and from Ireland as well. And essentially, the issues that were on the line were to stand up for Catholicism, which was represented by Charles Stewart. He was in support of Catholicism, and then maintenance of centuries-old lifestyle. This was on the line, it turns out, because if the combatants in Culloden were defeated, that would lead to what I spoke of a moment ago, the dismantling of the culture.
Right.
And the purpose of dismantling the culture was the Highlanders were a threat to people in the South. They felt threatened. I mean, primarily farming was one of the main economic aspects of life in the South, and the Highlanders threatened that because they were very in need of food, and their way of getting food, unfortunately, was to lift it.
Right.
Not necessarily to grow it.
Right.
Because the land was so severe in regard to its supporting agriculture that that was one avenue that they made use of, and that really made the people in the South very, very concerned. And so the reaction to lots of raiding, etc., was to really try to decimate the people altogether.
Right, right.
And they went pretty far with it.
So how might the pipes in this particular battle might have been used to summon people together and rouse them up to go into battle?
Well, BBC did a program called Culloden
Okay.
many years ago, and they used a lot of local people, and they set it up the way they saw the battle. Now, John Preble is a person who wrote some very good books on Highland history. One was The Massacre of Glencoe. It was about a clan feud that was promoted by the government. And then another one was the Battle of Culloden. And the third one was about the Highland clearances. So Culloden and the clearances. Well, the clearances took place in Ireland and Scotland. That was a government technique that was manifest through a twisting of the leadership. They got the leaders to do that for them. The English Parliament got the leaders of the clans to turn around and clear people off the land.
Right, right.
For more profit.
Right.
Anyway, without going right into that just now, the placement of the pipers, the basic idea is that most all clans had their a hereditary piper.
Okay.
So piping was passed from one family, one generation to the next generation.
Right.
And so if you were born into that family and you were a male, at that time a male, it was very possible that you would become a piper, and you would take on the job that the parent had, or
Right.
or the preceding piper, the uncle, parent. And so each of the clans, many of the clans, let's put it this way, must have had a piper. Those pipers led the clan to the battle line. They fought as many indigenous people fight. They didn't line up in straight lines necessarily. The British did. The British lined up cannons, muskets in disciplined straight lines. The pipers, that wasn't their, the clans, that was not their normal way of engaging. They were more route step, and I'm trying to think of the word for that kind of battle engagement, but it's I just can't think of the word right now, but
it wasn't like almost an imperial battle where you're saying it's like two lines and they kind of just march slowly. It was different than that.
Right. The British were organized in that manner, but the Highlanders were they were in group. My understanding is they were in groups, and they made their charge, and they charged into the cannon fire. The pipers were standing in the midst where they could be heard playing.
Right.
That's how they were positioned, as I understand it. It might have even been on a slight elevation, perhaps, but Culloden, the field at Culloden is very flat.
Okay.
So it's not likely that they had a whole lot of elevation. They were just, it was a very flat heath. So pipers were directly involved. They were in the battle. They were amongst their own family, hearing, most likely playing tunes that had meaning for them.
Sure.
That would encourage them to give everything they had to the situation. Pipers, as far as I know, carried arms, because if they couldn't play pipes, they would engage in the battle.
Right, right. And what about like in instances, would like the pipes be used as a call to battle?
Yes.
That say one clan's leader is having, they're not getting along, and we're like, okay, well, it's about to go down, and then we let my piper over here, Donald, strike a tune, and this is the tune that's like we're about to go to battle. I mean,
Yes.
could you imagine something like that being the case?
Absolutely the case. So absolutely the case. So I think it's highly likely that certain tunes were, in a sense, signal tunes.
Okay.
There's one
Would
tune.
these typically be like what are classified or called the gathering tunes?
Yeah, well, they did actually have tunes that were gathering tunes. I'll give you some examples. There's a tune called Tulachard.
Hmm.
This tune is associated with the Clan Mackenzie.
Okay.
And Tulachard was an assembly point. Consider once again that people would be living not in one tight little locale, but spread out over a whole valley. And the bagpipe, as I understand it, was at a lower pitch than it is today. And as we begin to examine some of the older chanters, they played below B flat.
Okay.
We are now approaching the note B. So our pitch is rising higher and higher, but those instruments were of a lower pitch. And the wood of the chanters was thicker.
Okay.
The chanter wood now, or material, is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. But those chanters would carry incredible distances.
Okay.
Because of their frequency and probably because of the mass of the wood.
Huh.
When I say thicker, I'm not talking, I mean, they're an eighth of an inch thicker in diameter, maybe estimated. That's a rough estimate.
Okay.
But those instruments didn't have to compete with airplanes, diesel trucks, helicopters,
Sure.
or any other man-made modern machine noise.
Of course.
They just had nature.
Right. Right.
Now, if the wind was powerful and was coming at the piper, that would have diminished the carry. But more typically in Scotland, the air was moist and the winds were certainly not severe 24/7. And that sound would go long distances as a communication device. So Tulachard was a signal tune. That meant drop what you're doing, pick up your sword, and appear at the rock known as Tulachard. That's what that's meant.
Okay.
There's a Clan Chatton had a gathering tune. When people heard that, they knew what it meant, and they must have had a predestined place to gather. It goes on and on. Clan Campbell's gathering was a signal tune. Now, something about the gathering tunes is they were made from the notes which carried the furthest.
Oh, okay.
So they had lots of low A's, B's, C's, D's, and E's. Not so many F's, not so many high G's, not so many high A's. I will admit, occasionally there would be a note like that in there. Sure. But the dominant notes of the composers would be the ones that could be heard the furthest.
So it had also a practical value to it.
Absolutely.
Right.
So your point about was the bagpipe used as a signaling device to tell people to go forward or to gather? The answer is absolutely yes. Okay. A recent bit of knowledge that I didn't have before came from Roderick Ross, who was the compiler of a great deal of Pete rock in a modern, very effective notation. And his roots are very steeped in Highland culture. He had a close connection with Clan McPherson, who had a number of outstanding pipers come from their environment. And Roddy Ross maintained that there's a tune called the Finger Lock, which I never knew the history of the Finger Lock. And he said the finger lock was a kind of a cheer that warriors did just prior to going into battle. They would lock hands and chant, and that's what this pibroch is about.
Okay.
And when you hear it and begin to think of the possible connection, it starts to make a lot of sense. It's like a warrior chant.
Right.
So this
right.
was to raise the spirit level of the people before they went into battle. So yes, an awful lot of the history of the ancient pipe music is associated with battles.
Okay. Okay.
And then if we go to the British Army's history, a lot of the pipe music that was composed was about experiences that pipers were trying to recall or remember or archive about battle experiences that they had had. Example of that would be the Battle of the Somme. That
Right.
would be an example of that.
So, could you discuss a little bit about, I guess, some of the primitive originations of pipe bands? For example, like before the Highlanders were joining to fight for the British, what might have pipe bands been like before? Were they playing with drummers, for example? Were they playing with other pipers together?
This is a good question. So it would have been unusual for pipers to play together before the 45 Rebellion.
Okay.
But after the 45 Rebellion, let's put it this way, some of the officers in these regiments were Highlanders themselves. And so the way the music regulations appeared was regiments were authorized or permitted, maybe a better word, to have musicians. And so a man who was an expert in this area was Colonel David Murray, who himself was an outstanding piper, a tremendously good piper. And he actually wrote a book on the music of the Highland regiments, which is a very informative book.
What year was he active?
Well,
Around?
he was certainly, to my knowledge, he was an active. He was active. I'm going to guess up until probably around about the 1980s, maybe.
Okay.
And a tune we hear mentioned often is DJ S. Murray.
Okay.
That's who we're referring to, Colonel David Murray of the Queen's Own Highlanders. And so he was a tremendous historian, a wonderful writer. He wrote a lot of articles for, if I'm not mistaken, it was Scottish Life magazine. And he had a running column called The Noble Instrument. And it was all about piping. And he was authoritative. That man really knew history very well. And I saw a paper that he delivered to the Pibroch Society, and in that paper he explained how piping came into the regiments. And he said that the regiments were authorized to have fifers and drummers. Now, try to imagine for a minute the old calligraphy for the letter F. It swirled around on the top and swirled around on the bottom, and it curled on the top. It would be very easy to look at an F and call it a P.
Right.
So the officers made use of that, and they said, well, we can have pipers.
Ah, nice little trick there. Very nice.
That's, according to David Murray, that's how it all began.
Wow.
The drummers were already present because the drummers were used as signalers in battle. They
Yes.
would play various drum beats that meant charge or hold your position or retreat. So the drummers were there. Presumably some fifers were there, but the officers paid out of their own pocket to bring in pipers
Okay.
and get them uniforms and bagpipes if needed.
I see.
And that tradition continued for many, many, many years. I don't know how. I dare say that even in the regiments that remain, the officers are still somehow involved in making sure the pipers have their place. So the early occasions were people that were not probably used to playing together at all, and they began. They were required to play, so they had to begin to figure out how to make that work, and that would have been, to my knowledge, the beginning of pipe bands. That's how it would have started.
Okay.
And we're now talking about probably the middle 1700s.
Okay.
Now, to go further, the regiments developed the pipe bands to a very high level. They became very expert at putting together pipes and drums, performing for ceremonial occasions and even daily routines. There would be certain parts of the day where the band might play. The most famous of those were the retreat ceremonies. The retreat ceremonies were kind of, in a way, reflecting on what had gone past. And it was kind of like a concert of sorts for the troops. Ceremonial sort of a concert kind of thing.
Right.
And so eventually, as we move into more modern times, post-World War I, post-World War II, where all sorts of people volunteered to participate. Now, what did these ex-soldiers do? Well, some of them were fit enough to work in coal mines. So they would leave, they would, be honorably discharged, and they would go back to their village, and there was employment working in coal mines. And some of them would join police forces because they had all the discipline of being soldiers, and it seemed a natural step to have that discipline and become a policeman. So probably going into the late 1800s, we began to see civilian pipe bands.
Okay.
These were no longer regimental pipe bands. These are ex-soldiers who wanted to continue having a band.
Sure.
And so police departments such as the Edinburgh Police and the Govan Police. Govan is a district of Glasgow. And so the district of Govan had its own police force, and they wanted a pipe band because a lot of the members of that force came from Scotland and Ireland. They were people who came to that city to make a living, and they played pipes.
Right.
So that's now we're beginning to get into the further development of civilian bands. We're getting into police department bands, and we're getting into bands affiliated with the coal mine. Now, something that took place in my locale in upstate New York is there was that whole period of Yankee manufacturing where people were making textiles, they were making machinery, and these factories, as a kind of a gesture to the workers, would say, let's have a band. So it might have been a brass band, but the factory would supply uniforms and help them purchase the instruments, and then they would play for important occasions. Well, it must have been much the same with the coal mines. So the coal mines, such as the Shotts and Dykehead Colliery, the Polkemet Colliery, and Boghall and Bathgate collieries. These are all coal mines, and they wanted to have bands. And so that's when people got even more focused on quality, 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 quality. The quality of the playing was coming up. And the police bands used to compete in the World Championships, have up to the present time. And so the Govan Police eventually became the Glasgow Police. It amalgamated more departments for more of the regions around Glasgow. Then it became the Strathclyde Police. That's now reaching even further out to outlying towns to draw talent all together and concentrate it. And the Edinburgh Police became the Lothian and Borders Police, again, bringing in more pipers from more outlying areas. And then these bands excelled. They excelled.
I guess it's safe to say then, with the this striving for high excellence, would you say that was also being fueled by the I guess intense competition from competitions themselves that were being created to sort of fuel these battles between the bands?
Absolutely the case. And you know how Scottish and Irish people are when it comes to sports. You know, the enthusiasm that people have about their home team.
Sure.
This is our team. Yeah. This is our team.
Right.
And so it's a great sense of feeling pride in where you came from and your community. And so the pipe bands also took on this mantle. You know, there was that, oh, this is our local band. And so it's true to this day.
What would you think, like, what were the big competitions that they were looking for? Like, like, this is the one we want to win.
Okay, well, one of the earlier pipe band competitions, which carried a great deal of importance for pipers and drummers and bands, was the cowl competition. Okay. So cowl is within, it's off the coast, off the west coast. You get there by ferry, and that had very good solo competitions on Friday and had very good band competitions on Saturday.
Okay. And
so soloists and bands were very eager to put in good performances at cowl. Somewhere along the way, and I don't know exactly when it started, but organizers put together the World Championships, the World Pipe Band Championships. And in the early years, they moved often from one city to another. Like one year, maybe they would be in Glasgow, another year, maybe in Edinburgh, another year, they'd be north in Inverness, etc. So for many years, going to the World Championships meant that you were going to go to some part of Scotland, but not necessarily the same place.
Right.
And in more recent years, it has, there's been an attraction for Glasgow Green.
Right.
In the center of Glasgow. And there are a lot of reasons why people have been in favor of that, because you get to know where it is that you're going to go back to.
Right.
And instead of trying to reinvent the wheel in regard to all the logistics.
Well,
so yeah.
I was going to say, it's funny you mentioned that, because I think there's been more talk, I guess especially before the pandemic, of potentially hosting it in different countries. Do you think that yes. might occur one day, or?
Yes, well, now you just hit a raw nerve. So many of us overseas people have felt that way. I think part of the reality is this. I'm sure that in time people have loved to go to Mecca. But if someone said to you, I'm going to move Mecca to Bayonne, New Jersey, because we have a huge space there, it may not mean quite the same to the people that went to Mecca.
Right.
Because it's Bayonne. God bless Bayonne, But back to your point, it's very strange, but it's kind of like a pilgrimage. And so there are bands in New Zealand, in South Africa, Australia. Now there are bands in China. There are bands in India, Pakistan, the Netherlands, all throughout Western and Central and Eastern Europe, and then all across Canada, all across the United States. And the bands in South America now, pipe bands in South America. And they have sort of set their sights on this one place.
Mhm.
So for those of us who have to spend a fortune to get there and wish we didn't have to, the Scots, to put the icing on the cake, really like having it close to home.
Sure.
While it makes sense in international sport, like the Olympics, for example, to move to different countries. And
I was
it's
wondering if we
totally
were going to
logical.
get to that level where bagpiping is going to be like the Olympics.
Well, exactly right. I mean, that has such wide universal appeal. But I don't know the statistics about the Worlds, but they get a huge number of pipe bands, a huge number. And the attendance on the big years is staggering. The number of people that come to hear all that is staggering.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the Olympics, I guess.
Yeah. So where should we go next? I guess we could go maybe back a little bit back in time again. Or we could even just talk about Pibroch. And when people talk about the glorious effects, I think there was even a documentary about some of the high players of Pibroch and discussing the effect that Pibroch has on its listeners. You can even see at some of the high level competitions where there's people and they have their hands folded over their chest, over their hearts, and they're kind of going into this sort of almost like a trance. People have even talked about how bagpipers can even have visions of being perhaps in the Battle of Glencoe or something like that. That might be a little bit more far-fetched, but do you think that there is this sort of mystical trance-like element with Pibroch?
Well, one of the things that excited me, Chris, about this interview is on this particular point, I believe you've raised one of the most important questions that can be asked. And I'll frame it in my own words, but it's in response to your question. Let me put it in very different words, but it's the same intent. And that is, what is it beyond notes on a page that may be important about Pibroch? I'll put it in those terms. Now to respond to that, one of my early teachers said, paraphrased, he said that the bagpipe and history are intertwined and you can't separate them from each other. As many years have gone by and I think back on that statement, I think that was profoundly important, and I'll explain. With the modern miracles of technology, we can self-teach. We can hear some of the best piping to be heard. We can study it. We can emulate it. We can try to achieve as near that as we can do and maybe go further, for sure. So that's a miracle. That is a miracle. That's a miracle that the ancients did not have. They had each other's presence. Ian Dall Mackay was in the presence of Patrick Og McCrimmon. Patrick Og conveyed something really special to Ian Dall, which he in turn came out in his most magnificent compositions. So that's something they did have. We don't have as much of that. We have more isolation. We live around the world in all the countries of the world, but there are many times, many thousands of miles between us and the person who's trying to deliver the message to us. So that's the upside and the downside. The upside is we have access to this information like never before. The downside is we're kind of almost forced to be in bell jars dotted around the world. Okay, so what's the upshot of this? The upshot is that we're beginning to hear phenomenally capable players, technically brilliant players coming from this scenario. But now this is the downside. The downside is I'm going to go so far as to say that if a player does not make an attempt to gain some insight to the people, the language, the culture from which this came, it will not be a complete circle. It will be missing something. And to be brutal, I think we're missing it.
Okay.
I think there are very few people that have got the full circle operating for them. Most people have gaps, and the gaps are created by the distance from us to the immediate source. When I was learning to play the pipes, I lived with a family in Scotland of pipers, and both the husband and wife in the family were fluent Gaelic speakers. And that teacher said to me many times, you don't need to be able to speak Gaelic to play pibroch. Because there was this sort of wave going around Scotland of, well, it's all good and well, but Donald MacLeod is a fluent speaker. And listen to how he plays pibroch. On the other side of the coin came Robert Reid. Robert Reid and his history is a fascinating history. Reid lived in Glasgow also. And I can only paraphrase, I wish I could remember the exact words, but he was being interviewed, I think, by a radio program host. And the host was suggesting that Reid had no Gaelic. And his response, if I could just remember the exact words, they're written in various things. He said, I was born in the shadow of a coal bunker. And beyond that, what the meaning beyond that was that he didn't grow up in a Gaelic speaking community. He grew up in the shadow of a coal bunker from a coal mine.
Right.
And he was considered to be one of the great pibroch players of the 20th century.
Right.
Great players and teachers. His point being, I'm not a fluent Gaelic speaker, but I can play pibroch. So this is the two sides of the philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
But now so much time has gone by since the passing of Robert Reid that I can look at my experience and say that this is more than notes on a page.
Of course.
Let's go back to something we spoke of early on in the interview. Pibroch, and for all intents and purposes, the bagpipe, more than anything else, is the voice of the Celtic people, the Gaelic speaking people. There are many other groups of people that are included in this that are not Gaelic speakers. But I'll put it this way, without developing some empathy and understanding of the culture from which it came, I don't think a person can experience the full 360 degrees of what piping is and what it means. So that's the first point I would make about the transmission of piping. That's what kept it from disappearing, because there were many occasions when ancient knowledge was about to be completely wiped from the face of the earth, and by some miracle it came down through largely one person who taught several people, and then it would happen again, and it would come down through one person who would teach several people. There have been many occasions going back to, again, that ominous 1745 date, when things were about to disappear and they didn't. And so why didn't they? And my answer is because there was more than notes on a page going on here.
You had in your article in The Voice expressed concern about how the younger pipers were not spending time with the older pipers. How do you think this might be addressed nowadays?
Another good question. So one of the experiences that we have, the longer we live, the more we have this experience, the more we see some human being who was I'll put it this way, was a recipient of a great deal of knowledge and was also a transmitter of a great deal of knowledge, pass on. They pass away. They're gone. So in my lifetime, I've seen many of these individuals, men and women, pass away. And so then if you came to understand what it was that they were trying to transmit to others, then you feel the loss. And you realize, oh, wow, it's such a loss. So this event repeats itself. The longer we're on the earth, the more times it will repeat itself. So now to your point about, well, how do you make available to young pipers the bearers of the tradition bearers? How do you get to the tradition bearers? Well, so the work you're doing at this moment is one way, is to make recordings so people could sit back and listen to these interviews and draw some of their own conclusions. But perhaps in the course of the interview, some doors will get opened. Oh, maybe I could look at this and find out more. There's very little that was written about this culture up until somewhere in the 1700s. There was people like Johnson and Boswell that would travel to the Highlands and observe things. And it's sometimes so superficial that it makes us laugh. It's so superficial. It's like they had no way of going deep into what they were experiencing, but they would remark about it.
What do you mean? What was superficial?
Johnson and Boswell, they do things like say, we had the privilege or we had the occasion to go hear a McCrimmon play. And there were some very fast flashes from his fingers. There you go. That's how's that? How you doing with that on that one, Chris?
Right,
about knowing exactly what the McCrimmons were about.
Yeah, right.
The man got up, put his hat on his head, blew up his bagpipe, and his fingers flashed incredibly fast.
Right.
Another comment in that book of the a journal of the Hebrides or something, or a journey to the Hebrides, was they talked about accommodation. They were able to stay with, like, can't remember the woman's name, a Mrs. McLeod. And the china upon which she served the tea was very quaint. See, that's good to know that.
Right,
That's good to know that.
Yeah.
It's like peeping through a tiny little crack in a door to try to
Right.
see what's going on in the room.
Right.
So that's English culture, enjoying the quaintness of the Scottish culture.
Right.
So that's where it began. So that's how little the writing was about all this. Most of it is oral folklore.
Yeah.
One person tells another person. That's mostly what we have to go on to try to dig back into this. Angus Mackay went to some length in his introduction to his paper collection to describe the physical circumstances of the McCrimmon College. Exactly what was it like?
Okay.
And he said things like this. He said there was an indenture for 7 years. So what's this about? I mentioned earlier that most of the clans had a clan piper, and they, in a sense, it would probably be like having a goal scoring forward on a soccer team that's your team. You wanted this goal scorer to be really good. So where do you get to train a person like this? Well, apparently the people that had the reputation were the McCrimmons.
Sure.
And the countryside that they lived in looked exactly like the countryside behind you right now in this interview. It was mountainous. It was near water. And it was exposed to the elements. If you ever have the enjoyment to make a pilgrimage to their school location, which is now just a bare ground mostly, Borrereg is the name of this location. It would be a rare day if you didn't experience high winds coming off Loch Dunvegan, enough to almost knock you off the mountain.
Right.
So and then there'll be the winter weather, and so in other words, it was a rugged surrounding.
Sure.
But this is where their school ended up. It started in a place called Galtrigal, which was provided to them by the chiefs of the MacLeods. But then it moved to Borrereg, which was nearby. And that's where they trained a lot of pipers over time. And so the way the training took place is the piper was indentured to the McCrimmons for 7 years. And it was their job to provide the education for this person to make them an exceptionally good piper.
And I'm assuming that this was quite rigorous. I guess if a piper was not showing enough talent, they might be dismissed.
This is a very good question. And about this one, I don't know the precise answer.
Okay.
Here's the impression that I have of what things might have been like. First off, the place in which they lived would be made of stone, like rubble stone, and would probably have a thatched roof. And according to Angus Mackay, it was an oblong-shaped structure. And in the center of the structure is where they kept the livestock.
Okay, wow.
Because they provided heat.
Okay.
Cattle provided heat. And so, in the words of Angus Mackay, the pipers lived in apartments surrounding the central area. Now, apartment was probably like a telephone booth, probably a tiny little cubicle.
Right,
okay?
right.
And they worked the croft along with the McCrimmons, so they had to do
Chores,
raise
almost.
crops. Yeah, they had to raise crops.
Right.
And when they were attacked, the residents had to also defend.
Oh my goodness.
Because that was real Viking attack country.
Right.
A lot of the MacLeod culture is one and the same as the Vikings.
Okay.
They used the same artistic ornamentation on their weapons. They used the same weapons. The MacLeods had, and most of the island clans operated galleys, just like the Viking boats, very similar. They could go under sail, but when there was not enough wind to take them where they needed to go, they had long oars, and all the people on that boat were oarsmen. And that actually began to shape some of the compositions of the McCrimmons. One of the compositions of the McCrimmons is the MacLeod's Salute. And the MacLeod Salute is also known as the MacLeod's Rowing pibroch. There are a number of pibrochs that were created for rowers so they could stay in unison. And the one part of the MacLeod Salute has this beautiful rowing movement. It's hun and hun and hum and yo and yo hun and hun and hum and yo and ha and ha and hun and he and hun and yo and hum and ha and ha. That goes into the next bit and it goes hun and hum and yo and hun and hey via hey and hun and ha and hey via yo and hum and hey via hey. So that beautiful rhythm was to keep the oars together. And one doesn't have to stretch the imagination very much to imagine a McCrimmon piper in the prow of the boat facing the crew and playing to them. So that's an example of how the pipes were used. Yes.
Were these known as sea pibrochs?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And there are a number of them.
Would you say that there probably was a good amount of sharing? Because when I think about that sort of a melody, and I would, excuse me, with the usage of the drones and piping, it almost kind of reminds you also of like old Nordic music.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's no question that that the coastlines of Ireland and Scotland were frequently attacked by Viking raids. And a lot of the names of the locations are Norse. For example, the suffix aig, ek, is Viking, Norse. And so the location of the Gaelic College in Scotland is a place called Salmor Ostek. Ostek is a Norse word. Sal means barn, and more means big, so it's a big barn. But it's at Ostek,
okay,
which is East Bay. That's what it means, East Bay, I believe. So that's just one of many examples. There's all kinds of Highland names of places that are very much Nordic. So there was a lot of skirmishing, and there's a lot of transfer of ideas through those cultures clashing.
Sure. So can you continue on again about what the college was like learning with the McCrimmons?
What I'm telling you is what Angus Mackay had written. So Angus was pretty close in time to all this.
What year approximately was this around?
He published, as I recall, he published his collection. He brought forward his manuscript somewhere around 1860-ish, somewhere in that time. And so, and shortly thereafter, I think he published his collection of pipe music, his first collection of pibroch, and then later there was some light music that he published. So he was closer to the time than by far than we were. But according to him, the main building was rectangular shape. There was a central room, which is where they kept the livestock in the cold weather, and that all the residents stayed in small cubicles around that central room. And the other thing is that when the conditions must have been harsh, so playing in high winds, playing in extreme rain, extreme cold, that was part of the game. That's probably what they did for sure. They certainly weren't in lovely heated carpeted rooms, with solar glass windows.
Right.
It was rough.
Yeah.
And they were rough. They were essentially tribesmen.
Right.
Living on a promontory on an island, facing a body of water, Loch Dunvegan. And across from where they stood, they could see Dunvegan Castle. So they had eye contact with what was going on across the water. It was the distance as the crow flies was probably about 8 miles. But to get from Dunvegan to Bagpipers, you had 2 ways to get there. You could either take a galley, a ship, and go across the loch and land on the bottom of the cliffs, because they were on top of a cliff.
Okay.
Or you could go by some form of transport around Loch Dunvegan, which was a long, long way. So there are 2 ways to get there. So they used the entrance to Dunvegan at that time was a sea entrance. I don't know that there was a land entrance.
Okay.
So they could defend it better if it was completely girded up on the land side. And the only way you could get into the castle was by sea. And there was a sea gate. So that's the kind of lay of that. And then for the pipers, apparently there are caves in the cliffs. And one way they could get out of the severe weather would be to go get into a cave, really, quite honestly. And there are a lot of legends about the McCrimmons and the caves.
Yes, I understand too, that some of the caves were considered magical and that the pipers would like to go inside and play. And you never know, though, there might be a beast inside that might, attack one of the pipers and all that.
There's the story, which is quite romantic, that I love about McCrimmons' sweetheart, the Peabrook McCrimmons' sweetheart, is probably not a true story. But the story is that it was a pupil of the McCrimmons, or a McCrimmon, in fact, who wanted to compose a Peabrook. And he decided that he would go into a cave and he would fast until this tune came to him.
Okay.
And this is the first story I heard about this McCrimmon sweetheart. There are about 3 stories about this tune. And at any rate, he would eventually fall asleep and he would dream about this Peabrook. He would hear it in his head. And when he would awake, he would play part of it. And each time he dreamt, he'd be able to remember more of it. And that's supposedly how McCrimmon's sweetheart was composed. Now, the scholars would probably disagree. And they would say this is what happened. The name of the Peabrook in Gaelic is Mull Down, which means sort of my beloved. And that would be a name, if someone was fortunate enough to own a cow, they would give it an affectionate name. And the one that most people believe about this is this was, this Mull Down was a cow that was owned by an old woman. And of course, it was her source of sustenance, milk and cheese.
Yeah.
And one day the cow wandered off into a bog and was lost. And this is a lament for the lost creature.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what most people think it's about.
Okay.
There's the third story.
There's always 3 stories, right?
Yes. And that Mull Down was like a king of Ireland.
Okay.
And that this tune was composed for that king.
I see. Interesting.
So there's 3 stories.
Yeah, right.
But back to the McCrimmons, they supposedly they did a lot of their practicing in the inclement weather in little nooks and crannies they could find on the cliff face. And there's a famous legend about Ian Dall Mackay, who was reckoned to be Patrick Ogg's greatest pupil. Now, he was already an accomplished piper for the clan Mackay, and but was sent to the McCrimmons for polishing. And I don't know if he was blind from birth, but he'd been blind for some time before he came to the McCrimmons. And he had an uncanny ability to learn and memorize tunes. The sort of thing that he could probably hear a tune once and he had it.
Okay.
Well, the legend is that this made some of the other students deeply jealous. So one day he was practicing near the edge of the cliff. And according to the legend, the students pushed him off the cliff.
Oh.
And apparently he landed on his feet, 40-foot drop.
Okay.
And the upshot of it all is he became one of the greatest composers of pibroch that we ever had. And apparently he was also a bard and he was also a harpist.
Okay.
But he's known to have composed the Lament for Patrick Ogg McCrimmon, the Unjust Incarceration, the Monroe Salute, and the Blind Piper's Obstinacy.
An appropriate tone in this situation.
Appropriate tune, yes. So just trying to summarize some thoughts. The McCrimmons were hereditary pipers to the MacLeods of Dunvegan. My dear friend John McCaskill, the late John McCaskill, his family were blacksmiths and boatsmen to the MacLeods. So these septs rather, many times they were specialists in something that everybody needed, and they perfected their art. It would be a little bit like sword makers for the samurai. These families knew things.
Almost like a guild, perhaps.
Like a guild, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so the McCaskills were boatsmen and blacksmiths, and the McCrimmons were musicians. Mm-hmm. And so they were called upon to fulfill the musical needs of the MacLeods. So in order for them to do what they had to do, the MacLeods gave them a parcel of land from which to operate. And the first one was Galtragal, but then shortly thereafter they moved to Borereg, and they were there till pretty much the school came to its end. So the strength of the school was dispersed finally. And the last of the McCrimmons may not have lived their entire life at Borereg. They may have lived nearby. Something that's curious about the McCrimmons is that they were so isolated that it was comparatively easy to trace their genealogy, because they weren't buzzing in and out of big population centers.
Right.
So their books, one book that I encountered was written by Fred T. MacLeod, and it's called A History of the McCrimmons. Okay. And this thing was probably published, I'm going to say, in the middle to early 1950s. And up to that point, he sort of knew where every McCrimmon had gone, every descendant of every McCrimmon.
Okay. Could you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
I was going to comment. So, I mean, we were talking a bit before about passing the teachings through like an oral tradition and about the McCrimmon family. How might you imagine what a lesson might be like with, if we were with the McCrimmons now and we were going over a new pibroch, what might be a lesson like?
Yes. Now this is going to be real speculation on my part.
Sure.
Just imagining what it might have been like.
Mhm.
Well, first off, something that is pretty interesting is, let me try to answer this question by talking about something that I'm more aware of.
Okay.
There are recordings of the late pipe major William McLean, who was, as a young piper, a kid, was sent to Malcolm McPherson Sr., Callum Pieper, meant Malcolm the Piper, to be advanced in his pibroch tuition. And that story, I'm sure, is recorded, tape recorded, and in the School of Scottish Studies archive, which is Topar and Dulchas, and that's online. They've taken their archive of recordings and put it all online.
Okay.
And that's worth seeking out and hearing William McLean tell this story. But I won't try to reiterate the exact story, but here are the main points of it. That he went to Dalwhinnie, which is up in the McPherson territory, by train. And Callum Pieper met him at the station, brought him to the house, where he met Angus McPherson. That's Callum's son, the late Angus McPherson. And they were about the same age, the two boys. And so they hung out a bit together. And then, in Willie's words, they went and chased rabbits for the supper.
Okay. Nice.
So there were wild rabbits, and they got some rabbits for the supper.
Right.
And then while they were, and then they had their supper. And the next morning they sat in front of the peat fire while breakfast was cooking and played jigs. This would be all three of them on the practice channel playing jigs. And now when it was time for Willie's lesson, he had brought a knapsack with him, and he sat down at the table and opened up the knapsack, and he pulled out a pibroch book. And Callum Pieper said, "Boy, if you need that, you're no use to me." All right, so there's the first point, that the music was going to be taught, but it wasn't going to be taught by looking at notes in a book.
Right, right.
So we can now fill in the blanks. That Callum Pieper would have sung to him and played to him, and Willie would have listened to what he heard and played it back. So that's the most important point, is that if someone was real and serious, this was going to be singing and listening. And then over a period of probably a few weeks, maybe even more, maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks, I don't know how long, Willie acquired between 30 and 40 pibroch from Callum Pieper. And then it was time to go back home. So Callum took him to the train and he headed home. I became friends with one of his pupils. I corresponded with him, and I got to see him a few times. His name was David Ross of Rose Hall. A famous march was written about him by Archibald MacNeil. It's a beautiful march. David Ross was an outstanding person. David Ross was taught by William McLean. He ran a gym down in London, and he used to call up Willie and have Willie sing over bits of pibrochs to him. So that this is the early days of online pibroch tuition.
Right.
And I heard David playing. He was close to 80 years old, playing at the former winners pirogue competition at Inverness. And as I recall, he came second to John McClellan. He was at 80 years old. John was at his peak. And he played the Prince's Salute, which is a very challenging piece of music to play. I made a recording, an illegal recording. It was underneath my Inverness cape.
There you go.
And I played the recording for Bob Brown, and he was most impressed with the quality of the playing. And I went up to David Ross, after he played. It was 1970 that I did this recording. And I said, I really enjoyed your performance, David. Thank you very much. And I said, that's all I said. And his response to me was, oh, I learned that in bits and pieces, and took me about 20 years to get till finally the penny dropped. What he's saying is he learned phrases until he had the phrases mastered. There's some tricky stuff in the Prince's Salute about how to time certain things. Now we're back to the McCrimmons. I think the McCrimmons were taught pretty much that way. That's how they taught their pupils. When it was time to learn a pirogue, it might begin with the student, hearing one of the McCrimmons playing it and saying, I'd like to learn that tune. And then it was done by singing probably small phrases until the pupil had mastered the timing. And ultimately the pupil would put the whole thing together. And so I think it was that, and it was day-to-day life. I think there would be opportunities to learn tunes and play them and hear the McCrimmons playing. And then there would be the work of trying to get what little food they could get out of their little croft garden. And presumably fishing. I mean, that's the other food source. They were right there down the bottom of the cliffs was the water, and they probably were doing some fishing as well.
Sure. And
fishing and crofting, and God forbid they were attacked, but they would have to defend themselves.
Right.
So I mean, I think that's my impression of what it might have been like to be there.
Thank you. That was very insightful, because I think, I guess my initial impression, it's like, oh, wow, this is cool. I'm hanging out with some of the greatest pipers in Scotland. I'm learning, but you're saying like it was also extremely difficult, and that added, whether I would have liked it or not, to the experience, the immense hardship that they were going through. You touched a lot upon, with the teaching of oral traditions, and obviously, eventually with Pibroch, it was, people started writing it down, and they started publishing large collections of tunes. What do you think the effect of that was? I guess perhaps what were some of the pros and cons of starting to publish these tunes into a written publication?
Your phrase pros and cons sums it up very, very well. So the pros, this meant that people could be dispersed outside an immediate community of musicians, open a book and see which notes needed to be played. This was revolutionary. Prior to this, you had to pretty much be in the presence of someone who knew the music and wanted to share it. So this allowed for people to be around the globe, have the book, and learn from the book. The price of the published book was equivalent to a normal working man's salary for 1 year. The book cost £5. That's what someone might earn, a laborer could earn that in 1 year.
Okay.
A year's salary.
Yeah.
And for the same amount of money, a person could purchase the best set of silver and ivory Henderson bagpipes, hand engraved silver, 5 pounds. So a book was a very expensive thing.
Mhm.
It would be even more expensive than buying a computer
Yeah.
to have one book, like the Angus Mackay book, for example. And to assist in the printing of that book, the royal family made donations, as well as many of the peerage. They would just contribute, they would pay, they'd subscribe to the book to help pay for the printing. So printing was expensive, and that was a reality. Plus side, you could be anywhere in the world. If you could read notes, you could begin to play this pibroch. Downside, the separation of the pibroch from its source. And I think we're seeing the fruition of that in a very odd sort of way in 2021. As I said earlier in our get together today, the technical proficiency of the current up and coming generation of pipers is fabulous. The quality of the instruments, their workmanship is fabulous. It was fabulous in its own way a couple hundred years ago. It was all handwork,
Mhm.
largely, but it was exquisite work. Now it's guided by computer lathes, and the design is good and the production is good. They're making good instruments. So that part's pretty interesting, how that has evolved. But this brings us to the downside of printed notation. It can only go part of the way to help us understand the feeling behind the music. And that's where it drops off. And now the challenge is for the player to try to get beyond the dots on the page and figure out what is behind this, what is being communicated, how can I do it? The people who are still on this earth, who understand something of this, will do it by singing. That's how they will overcome the roadblocks. People will know what notes to play. They will have a clear idea on how to play them. But to get to the feeling behind it, we have to contradict what's on the page sometimes.
Mhm.
And that's done by somebody who has a vision about the tune.
Do you think that also applies to light music as well?
Yes, because there's such a thing as playing an immaculately correct rendition of a piece of light music, and then all of a sudden you hear someone play that where there's more coming out than just the notes. So the answer is yes.
Okay.
It's critical with pibroch because the more musically aware someone is, I think the more they can do with light music without as much external help. But the truth is that every category of light music is an idiom, and the idiom has certain characteristics, and somehow the person has to get to know what those characteristics are. The prime example of this would be the strathspey. Someone who has not had the experience of playing strathspeys for dancers and understanding what makes them work and why they don't work is at a great disadvantage in playing strathspeys.
I've
strathspeys,
heard this from a piper before who said that they had a pipe major teaching them strathspey, and they said that the first step was you're all going to go out and dance to the music.
there it is.
Because without that, how can you understand dance music without even doing the first thing, which is the dance?
Which is very good philosophical advice from that person. And so the way the Highland regiments handle that is all of the pipers are trained to be Highland dancers as well as pipers. The Strathspey is not 1 + 1 = 2. It's like 1.5 plus 2 9/10 equals whatever that equals.
Right, right.
It's not just a simple logical progression of note values.
Well, since we're on the subject, could you tell us a little bit about the tradition of the dance, of the sword dance? There's the very famous background about how pipers used to do that before a battle to kind of test their agility and that sort of stuff.
Yes, well, that's the little I know. Is not much more than you said, that these were tribal tests of a warrior's strength and stamina. And I think that the legends go and trace the origin of this to ancient leaders, and that's where I'm out of my depth. But I believe that the sword dance and the fling were both meant to be tests of strength and stamina. And I seriously wonder if they had the precision that we see now from the great Highland dancers. It would appear that as time passed, the Scottish people got exposed to the French ballet, and they idealized some of the strength and beauty of those movements and made that an important part of Highland dancing. So that nowadays what we see are people who are extremely skilled at movement, strength, agility, and a certain amount of grace, and all that is quite well represented by the modern champion Highland dancers. But I think it was more of a warrior's ritual, going back to the early days of it.
Okay. Going back to Piobaireachd, I've heard mentioned before when I got to see the Nickel Brown competition that there was a third missing book of Piobaireachd. Is
Yep.
this part of the Colin Campbell Cataract volume?
Yes, it is.
And has there been any update on this missing book? I mean, I would imagine that if it's one of 3 that would be missing, that's a massive thing to find if that gets brought out to the public.
Well, it turns out that one of the first annotators of Piobaireachd was, I'm forgetting if it's Duncan or Colin Campbell. I guess it was Colin Campbell, but it was a Campbell that notated the many Piobaireachds meticulously. He was very meticulous in how he did it, and took these syllables and gave them meaning, so that more than any other system of counter-arc, the Campbell counter-arc pans out. This syllable means this note and that grace note. That syllable means the same note with a different grace note, that type of thing. There are a couple overlaps. The plain scale, the first few notes are M, N, O, O, A. So we have 2 of the same syllables for 2 different notes.
Right.
But that becomes clear in context. Once you start to see what the whole pattern is, you realize, oh, that can only be a B, and oh, that can only be a C. So that's how that works. There is a Piobaireachd counter-arc notation by Neil MacLeod of Gesto, and that's got syllables, but there's a lot of overlaps where this one syllable means 3 different things. And there's supposedly, quote, a McCrimmon counter, same problem. We have a bunch of syllables, but there's all these black holes where is it a this or a that? So the Campbell is the most complete. Now the manuscript. Many of the tunes that we nowadays play came from the two manuscripts that we still have. And not all of those tunes have been translated into staff notation or recorded until my very good friend Patrick Millard and Jack Taylor, both pupils of Brown and Nickel, they published everything that was left in the two volumes. Jack put it in notation and Patrick played it. Now back to the missing volume. The story is, I think it was in the early 1900s, and I think it was Sheriff Grant that saw an advert somewhere for a set of bagpipes. And he went to the lady's house to buy the pipes, and he bought the pipes. And as he was leaving, she said, I have a book that might be of interest to you. So he turned back, or I have some books. And he turned back, and apparently she had the three volumes of the Counterach. And so he looked it over and thought, this is important. And so he acquired those three books. And then somewhere along the line, the early 1900s, one of the books disappeared. Has never been seen of or heard of since. So we can only speculate what has happened. What has happened to it. And this is part of my theory. There are a lot of private libraries in the world.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Donald. Do you mind just facing the camera so we can see your face?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I bumped the stand.
That's okay. So you were saying.
You mean this isn't good enough?
There you go. Much better now.
I'm sorry. Pardon me. So anyway, this volume went missing. And if you look at all the tunes that have come from the two volumes we have, you realize the third volume must have had very important tunes in it.
Of course.
But no one knows where it is. My theory is that a manuscript like this is so important, it would have been bound. And if you consider the possibility of many private libraries, it might have been stuck in with a bunch of other books that look similar and be sitting on a shelf somewhere in some remote library somewhere. That's a possibility. This other one I hate to think of. The Free Church of Scotland was a very extreme right wing branch of Christianity, and they felt that the written word was evil. So they basically felt that their parishioners should burn any books that they had and any musical instruments. They felt the musical instruments were also very corrupting of their parishioners. So they burned a lot of books and they burned a lot of instruments. And I hope to goodness someone didn't have a copy of the Counterach and burn it. Beyond that, an appeal was put out by members of the People's Society on a few occasions, even quite recently. If anyone has any knowledge, please contact us. But so far, we do not see it. But what's come from those is a real important part of our repertoire.
Yeah, I mean, I could just only imagine that hopefully, one day it's found that it would just, who knows? I mean, there just might be a bunch of new pibrochs that, we didn't even know that existed.
Absolutely the case.
Yeah.
This book that Jack Taylor and Patrick Millard produced is called The Piper's Gathering. And that's recent. It came out somewhat recently, a couple of years ago. And there's a whole bunch of music there that's new to pretty much all of us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious. I've heard before that Queen Victoria was a big fan of the bagpipes. She was actually the first to have her own piper, if I'm not mistaken. Piper to the
Uh,
Queen, perhaps.
well, okay, let me respond. Um, if I think of piping, I can think of the ancient period when we had clan pipers and there were schools of pipers, meaning there were people who were in a good place to teach the skill to others.
Mhm.
The most famous of those was the McCrimmons, but there were other clans that had training places for pipers. The McDonalds had a school run by the MacArthurs. The McLeans had a school run by the Rankins. Um, the McGregors had a piping school as well. Those are just a few, but there were more. The Mackays of Rossay and the Mackays of Gairloch were also major ancient teaching sources who produced very, very great pupils. Now let's fast forward. I was describing a period leading up to and past 1745 into the probably early and somewhat later than early 1800s. At this point, those pipers had dispersed and were not all localized at Borderecht and Skye. They were living on the mainland and moved around, the descendants of the McCrimmons. Now comes a period of Queen Victoria. So to be very simple, talk about a very simple idea, the British government was harsh on its response to the 45 rebellion. And it was very vindictive after the rebellion. I learned about this through John Preble's writings. Remember, I mentioned 3 volumes: Massacre of Glencoe, Culloden, and then the clearances, Highland clearances. So Queen Victoria became very, very focused on, in my words, trying to repair some of the damage that was done to the Scottish culture after the 45 rebellion. And the way in which she did this was to be very outspoken about her enjoyment in going to Balmoral and spending time in Balmoral. And she went out of her way in many, many ways to endorse and foster Scottish culture, Highland culture especially. And that included piping. It included wearing Highland dress. Remember, I told you that the bagpipe was forbidden and the kilt was forbidden. So she reacted in exactly the opposing response. So it began, to my knowledge, this way. She frequented Balmoral. She loved being at Balmoral. And of course, all the heads of state around the world to see her would go to Balmoral. And when they went to Balmoral, they were expected to be in Highland dress, no matter where they were coming from. The men were expected to be wearing kilts when they went to Balmoral. And so that's that. Now, as far as the piper is concerned, the royal family would have a factor. A factor would be the sort of logistics person or on the ground producer, if you will, And so the factor was asked to find the best piper in Scotland. And so the factor went to John Ben Mackenzie, who was reckoned to be absolutely the best player. And interestingly enough, John Ben Mackenzie's response was to graciously decline the offer. And he said, I think that Angus Mackay is your man. So the factor went to Angus Mackay, and Angus Mackay was delighted to be asked. And he became the Queen's Piper. And while he was the Queen's Piper, wherever she traveled, whether it was Balmoral or London, he was there. And he was there to play functions, events, ceremonies, or just for the pure enjoyment of the royal family. And so he, to my knowledge, they refer to him as a sovereign piper. And to my knowledge, he was the first of them that I knew, but there may have been others. But as far as Queen Victoria was concerned, I think he was the first sovereign piper. Okay. So in short, all the time that she reigned, anything to do with Scotland was considered to be pretty cool.
Okay. Was this around the time when the Caledonian Society of London was coming about? Okay.
Yes. A lot of the gentry of Great Britain was in effect affected by this, and it took the form of various things. Caledonian Society of London, the Caledonian Society of Scotland. There were many romantic articles written where people would speculate about a blend of history and legends, and they would write profusely about this. So there was a lot of speculation about the unwritten parts of Highland history. There was speculation about the bards, and romanticized. It was quite romanticized. And I'm sure that the Queen Victoria's attitude about all this, in a way, fostered some of this. There were allusions to some of the old Scottish mythology and Celtic mythology. Ossian was referred to quite often.
What is that?
Ossian was a mythological figure in ancient Celtic lore and mythology, and probably was linked to Cuchulainn, and linked to Bran, and linked to Fionnuala. These are some of the ancient Celtic gods and goddesses and warriors. So there was a sort of a intense interest in that kind of mythology, and it was applied to the Highlands. And people began to, in my opinion, speculate as to what the Highlands were about and the Highland culture was about. And perhaps some of it was rooted in true fact, and some of it was just sort of romantic imagination. So at any rate, she had a profound effect on the British national culture, and an important part of that was, in a way, to make some kind of cultural restitution for the cruelty and damage that was inflicted on the Scottish people. And so there were a series of sovereign pipers. One of them certainly was Angus Mackay. Another one that came along was William Ross, but not to be confused with Willie Ross from Edinburgh Castle, who was a great piper in his own right. This William Ross was a piper to Queen Victoria. And where I'm going with this is, this led to a whole era of household pipers. And so what was the scene like for that? This was the people at this point who now owned estates, and a lot of these estates were in the northeast of Scotland, within range of Balmoral. And the idea is that the person who owned the estate was well enough off that they could hire a piper as a personal piper, and that piper would usually have double duty. They would play pipes, but they would be gardeners, or they'd play pipes, they'd be deer stalkers, or they'd play pipes, they'd be what am I trying to say? They'd be managing the land in some way.
Sure.
And so one of these estates was Glentrewham. That's where John MacDonald's father was a gamekeeper. And as a young person, John MacDonald was a gamekeeper at Glentrewham. Certainly another one was Balmoral. And when Bob Brown was quite young, and Bob Nicol was quite young, King George V wanted to have two good pipers at the estate. So his factor approached, I don't know who was invited first, if it was Nicol or Brown, but they both ended up getting invited to take that position. And they were both gamekeepers. So they lived at Balmoral pretty much year round when the Queen even went south to London. When she went to London, she had a personal piper there. And that guy was Alex MacDonald.
Okay.
And he was an excellent player. And he was her personal piper in London, and Brown and Nicol were pipers to the royal family at Balmoral. And they spent their life there. They played pipes for the royal family, and they functioned as gamekeepers, both of them. Bob Brown was extremely knowledgeable about salmon and about deer and grouse. And so when Prince Charles came along, Bob Brown taught him to salmon fish. And that's all written up in the Gordon Highlanders collection. There are memoirs from Prince Charles about his memoirs of Bob Brown, teaching him to fish and playing around the table at Balmoral.
Okay.
It's a good little read to see what is said on that. And I had the privilege of living with Bob and Annie Brown in 1970. My wife and I both went and stayed with the Brown family, and I was getting PBUC tuition. I had been getting PBUC tuition from Bob Brown in 1966, all the way up to 1970.
Okay.
And I was getting, he was coming over here to Invermark. He came over, the first year he came over was 1966, I believe. And he came over every year until the year he passed away. And then, which is, I want to say 1970, I want to say it was 1972, I believe. And then I did this by myself the next year, and then we were able to get Bob Brown to come over for a few years. I mean, Bob Nicol to come over for a few years. And I went and saw Bob Nicol in 1977 for probably better part of 7 weeks.
Did they ever talk about like where I mean, like they had learned from John MacDonald of Inverness. Did they
Yes.
have any stories to say about him and learning from him?
Oh yes, a lot of stories.
I think everybody would love to hear about this.
Well, many of the stories I would tell you are stories that have been recorded and archived
Okay.
by, for example, the School of Scottish Studies. But I'll tell you some of those stories. the king first sent Bob Nickel to John MacDonald, and they would be sent in the quote off season when their duties as gamekeepers were less pressing than they would be during, say, the shooting season, for example. So Bob Nickel was the first to go for lessons, and this brings me to another point, and the point is this: if you were going to learn a skill in Scotland, it's highly likely that you would serve an apprenticeship.
Mhm.
That's how skills were taught.
Yeah.
In later years, there may maybe be more classroom emphasis mixed with on the job tuition.
Mhm.
But if you're going to learn to be gardener, you wouldn't have that much classroom instruction. You would just get,
Be out of the
you would
garden.
work alongside a highly experienced gardener,
Sure.
and you would be going through the apprentice program. And that means if you've ever gone anywhere near being an apprentice, the first thing that typically happens is there is an assessment of the student's ego.
Okay.
And if the student has a very big ego that the instructor thinks will get in the way of their learning, there's generally a concerted, directed attack on the ego. Now, that's an important footnote, because then the stories will start to make more sense. I suspect that Bob Nickel was a pretty highly regarded piper in his neck of the woods. So he walked through the door of number 3 Percival Road in Inverness, and my hunch is that John MacDonald could smell an ego 150 miles away.
Sure.
So the first reports from Bob Nickel were John MacDonald saying, "What are you doing here? You are wasting my time." That was the warm greeting that Bob Nickel got
Oh my goodness.
from John MacDonald, because I think John MacDonald sensed this guy's got a real big head.
Right. So he put him in his place right away.
Yeah, this is the apprenticeship system.
Yeah,
This is the point I
right.
want to make. Many of us are not acquainted with how that works. My father was an apprentice, and I started being guided down the pathway of marine engineering via the apprentice route. So I began to get the picture. Mine was more classroom oriented, but
I
that's
see.
another story for another day.
Right.
Anyway, so Bob Nickel was taken through several P-Rocks, and then it was time to go back to Balmoral. And Nickel said he had the feeling that he didn't think he would be asked back again. So time goes forward. Sure enough, eventually a letter comes from John MacDonald, and the letter says, "I'd be quite happy to have Nickel back."
Oh, very
This
nice
went to the
turnaround of
factor.
events.
This went to the factor. The factor is like the legal representative for the royal family, right?
Okay.
Everything that's the factor is like the gatekeeper.
Right.
If something's coming in, it goes through the factor. If something's going out, it goes through the factor. So
Right.
if the king wants these guys to get tuition, he tells the factor, and the factor handles the details. So the letter comes back. I'd be quite happy to have Nickel again. So this time the king sent Nickel and Brown. And the quote was, "Two heads are better than one. What one forgets, the other will remember," which showed that the king was a pretty smart guy, because that's exactly what did happen.
Okay.
That's exactly what did happen. So in the words of those guys, they'd see John MacDonald, they'd probably have accommodation somewhere in Aberdeen, but I don't know. I mean, Inverness. Maybe it was in his house. I don't know that. It might have been. But the point is, they were there for an extended period, and they would each learn 20 or 30 pibrochs, different ones. So they'd come home with between 40 and 60 new tunes between them. And that winter, they would learn each other's tunes.
Okay.
This went on for years.
Okay.
And out of the blue, when they were getting lessons, they would always ask John McDonald for the tunes. Nickel would say, I'd like to do MacDonald of Morar, and Brown would say, I would like to do Donald Dougal Mackay or something. And then John McDonald would say, well, the best book to get this from is Kilmore, but that one, you'd be better off getting it from the Donald McDonald book. And that's how it went. So he was still working. John McDonald was a sales representative for the tenants company. That meant he was taking orders for deliveries to like hotels, hotel bars, and this type of thing. That's what I think he was doing. I don't know specifically, but I know he worked for the tenants company and he traveled. And that's another story, that the good things that came from him traveling. But so that's how things proceeded. And when they went, they would say in the morning, John, I'd like this tune. And he'd say, that, oh, yes, that'll be good. And by the way, Brown, I haven't heard you playing Donald Grumach for a year. I'd like to hear that as well. And Nickel, I haven't heard you playing The Route of Glenfruin for a year. So any tune they were given, they had to be able to play at any given time.
Right.
And so they spent their winters. I know that Bob Brown had a television. I know this, but they didn't really go seeking a lot of entertainment or distraction. Their winters, they spent time with their family, and then they chose to play pipes.
Right.
So, and Bob Brown had a great place to play pipes because he was provided with a house by the royal family, and it was called the Garibaldi Shield. And it was in a portion of the Balmoral estate called the Ballachbuie Forest. And he had this building was made of granite, and it was one story. And from the air, it looked like a Roman capital I. It had a long center section and then two wings at either end. The wings were the bedrooms. And there were some rooms in the long section. There was a kitchen, a living room, and a dining room. But Bob's piping room was one of the ones in the long I section. And that's what it was. There were two of those comfortable leather chairs and lots of and bagpipes and a lot of books.
Yeah.
And that's where we'd go for our lessons. And that's where he and Bob Nickel would meet through the winter regularly. And they would play tunes for one another, and then they would debate how they were taught to play them.
Nice.
Imagine doing that for most of your life, how sure you would become about how you're playing a tune.
Right.
And that's why their knowledge was so formidable, because they had tested their knowledge repeatedly.
So I guess another question I was kind of curious was about, Donald MacLeod, who was actually someone I understand used to live about a block away from him when you were living in Scotland.
Yes.
I understand too, he was also someone who learned from Bob Brown and Bob Nickel.
No. His primary teacher was John McDonald of Inverness.
Okay.
There were exchanges for sure between the Bobs and Donald MacLeod, absolutely. But his main teacher, John McDonald of Inverness.
Okay. So then, yeah, I mean, obviously, he had a big impact on Donald MacLeod. Well, I guess, I'm just kind of curious because, I mean, not a lot of people obviously have met Donald MacLeod. What was he like personally?
He was amazing.
Yeah.
First off, He was affectionately known in the piping world as Wee Donald,
Okay.
because there were some other pipers. Big Donald McLean of Lewis was one of them.
Okay.
And D.R. McLennan was another one, Donald McLennan. These are big, tall fellas, but
Okay.
Donald McLeod was very modest in height, extremely modest.
Okay.
I'll tell you a wee story. In Scotland, in the piping world, when a sad occasion comes of a piper passing, that person is usually, people go out of their way to be at any remembrance ceremony. And such was the case on one time when Donald McLeod was playing a memorial for someone. And I was it was a small group of people, and there were probably 20, 30 people there. And I was standing next to a Highland man who was very quiet spoken and very well spoken. And we were listening to Donald McLeod play. I think he was playing a P-rock actually for this person. And this gentleman turned to me and said, "What a perfect little man." There was everything about the man was so pleasant. He had a very, very warm personality. He was very witty. The wit was just about how funny the world is. It was never an attack on a person, never.
Mhm.
I never ever heard him say anything bad about anybody. But he would get you laughing because he was so clever and so witty. And what a player.
Yeah.
One of my thoughts on Donald McLeod is I had the privilege on several occasions of hearing him do performances. And I've never heard a piper that could flow from one tune to another as well as him. It's like tunes just flowed seamlessly one into another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And huge variety. It's hard to think of many occasions when he played the same tune twice. He had a huge repertoire. Here's another story about Donald McLeod. Jim McIntosh joined the Cameron Highlanders as a boy soldier. You could go in at a young age if you were sponsored. And then if you decide you want to stay on, you could become a fully designated member of the regiment. So as far as I know, the Cameron Highlanders were grouped with several other regiments to form the 51st Highland Division. And that would be with the Seaforths and possibly the Gordons. And so every now and then, the 51st Highland Division would be called on to perform for some, like the Queen's birthday, that would be an example. And so they'd bus everybody down to London and they would play at Buckingham Palace as, 3 Highland divisions,
Right.
3 Highland regiments, I'm sorry, or more.
Mm-hmm.
So they were rehearsing for some big thing. And so Jimmy McIntosh described the rehearsal. Donald McLeod was in charge. He was the pipe major in charge. They would get to the practice hall at 8 o'clock. Donald McLeod would be there. He would open his pipe case. He would tune up his pipes. He'd play till 12, and then they would go to lunch. That was the band practice.
Yeah, I was
he'd
wondering,
never
I was like,
repeat himself.
what am I not getting? I was like, so the band didn't practice then.
No, they didn't.
Okay.
But that's how vast his repertoire was. He'd do that and never repeat a tune. Huge repertoire. Yeah. He was very kind to me. I was supposed to be in engineering school. I would skip out of class and I'd go to the back room at Granger and Campbell's Bagpipe and Highland Dress Company, which was located on a little alley off of Argyle Street in Glasgow. And I'd go there just so I could hang out and listen to Donald McLeod chat and meet with pipers. There was a steady stream of pipers, a lot of them from the Glasgow police, that would find their way into the back room of Granger and Campbell every afternoon.
Okay.
Every afternoon. Guys like Ronald Laurie and Angus J. McClellan and Ian McClellan, the pipe major of Strathclyde. Another guy that showed up there a lot was Tom Anderson. He's the guy that wrote The Train Journey North.
Okay.
And Tom was from Ireland, and Tom was going to Brittany a lot. And he was going to Granger's to pick up sets of bagpipes to bring to Brittany because piping was really flourishing in Brittany, the interest. And Tom Anderson was a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so just the rapport was always very witty that was being exchanged in the back room of Granger's. Meanwhile, Donald was tying in pipe bags, fitting reeds into sets of pipes, boxing them up and shipping them to the customers. And on more than one occasion, Donald would say to me, "Donald, I just haven't had a chance to play my pipes today. Would you mind terribly taking them and having a tune?" And so Granger and Campbell had this little fitting room. It was like a telephone booth.
Right.
It had mirrors on 3 sides, and you could just get 2 people in there.
Right.
They'd measure people for kilts.
I see.
So I'd go into the fitting room with these bagpipes and start playing. And I'd play for maybe an hour or so, and thrilled to bits to be doing this. And then I'd stop, and Donald say, "Donald, I think I might have a tune myself." And so he would fire them up, and I'd get to hear him playing, and
were these his personal sets?
yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. They were.
What were those pipes like to play?
It was like having a dream experience, except that you were awake.
Right. Okay. Nice.
So I would get emotionally very elevated.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it was so exciting.
What kind of pipes was he playing?
That set I was playing there, to the best of my knowledge, was an old set of Hendersons.
Okay.
In immaculate condition, hand engraved silver, lovely drones. And the Granger and Campbell Channer had its ups and downs. There were some good ones and some not so good ones, but this was a really good Granger Channer.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm told that sometimes he was loaned a set of pipes for the clasp at Inverness.
Okay.
And I was told that he was sometimes loaned a silver and ivory set of McDougall drones.
Okay.
By one of his friends, his piping friends. But the other thing is that he had a workbench, and then he had a kind of a cork board behind it, a bulletin board. And there were all these little pieces of paper tacked onto the bulletin board. And they were all the beginnings of tunes.
Okay.
So if he got an idea, he'd scribble down the beginning and tack it up on the book.
Nice.
And of course, his output of music was tantamount to Mozart.
Right.
It just poured out of him.
I can only imagine. And so from what I saw in your article or your interview with The Voice, you got to see him perform at a place, and it was sort of like a pipers club, and a lot of people would just go there, and it was also just very it wasn't just the elite of pipers. It was a wide array of even just beginning pipers. What was that experience like, being at the time? I mean, you were in Scotland of all places, and you must have been, like you said, it was like a dream for you.
Well, this was a great thing. I was at that point in my life, this is before I had really met Bob Brown.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting tuition from John McFadgen.
Okay.
And he was coming over summer schools and teaching. And after a couple of years, one day it was time for me to go to college. So I had applied to Lafayette. I applied to several colleges, but I'd been accepted at Lafayette College, the same place that Lorna went, same college. And I was all excited about it. Easton, Pennsylvania, I believe, was located.
Mhm.
And but John said, you know, there's an opening at Paisley Tech in the mechanical engineering. All I heard was the word Paisley. It was like I only heard one word, Paisley.
Right, right.
So that was it. I said, I would like to go there.
That's funny.
So much for Lafayette College. I sent my apologies.
Right, right.
But and so I went to Paisley, and so I arrived at what was the airport then? It wasn't Glasgow International. It was Prestwick, and John met me there, and I got off, went through the terminal and got into the car, and we drove to Glasgow, to his neighborhood. And I remember, this is the first time I'd been in Scotland. I remember, of course, it was, when was it? It was probably late August. And I remember looking out the window of the car, and I'd never seen grass so green ever in my life. The grass was a deep, 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 beautiful, beautiful green. And the roadway was that red surface they put on it. It's a red sandstone or something. I don't know what it is, but it's all paved. And it was immaculate because it had been raining. There was not anything on it, but I just saw that and thought, wow, this is really beautiful. Then fast forward, we arrived at his home, and he was living in a neighborhood called Cardonald Gardens.
Okay.
And it turns out that his mom was only a couple blocks away.
Mm-hmm.
Donald McLeod lived in Cardonald Gardens. A whole pile of really good pipers lived there. So when I went out to do errands and things, pick things up for the household, I would bump into Donald McLeod, quite often.
Nice.
So it was a pretty cool place to be. I really liked it. And I used to go out in the backyard. He had a garden shed.
Okay.
And I would want to practice every day. And he would try to discourage me from practicing on Sundays.
Okay.
Because it was the Sabbath.
Right, right.
But I could sneak into the garden shed with his blessing, and I could practice it.
That's funny.
Anyway, but the first thing that happened is we got to his house, and I went upstairs, and my little room was upstairs, and I went upstairs with my suitcase, and I put the suitcase on the bed, and John said, "We must make you a member of the Scottish Pipers Association." He was the president at the time.
Okay.
So I had no idea what that meant, but I said, oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That would be very nice. And so Saturday, the Scottish Pipers Association would meet 9 months out of the year, except for the Highland Games months.
Right. Okay.
And a lot of these groups met in a place called the Highlanders Institute.
Okay.
And this Highlanders Institute was on Elm Bank Street in Glasgow, next to the Mitchell Library, which is a lot of pipe music books were in the Mitchell Library, and manuscripts, everything. So it was a modern building because the old Highlanders Institute had a fire and burned. Mm. And all I knew was the stories people told me about what great acoustics the old Highlanders Institute had. It was probably a big auditorium, and they probably did a lot of concerts there and stuff. But anyway, this was a modern building. It was about, I don't know how many stories tall, but 4 or 5 stories, all glass on the outside. And I'd go there. I went there. They would meet Saturday nights, and they'd meet from 6:30 in the evening till about 11 o'clock at night. And so I went there, and the secretary was Dolina Mackay. same person they wrote the reel for.
Oh, wow.
Dolina was the secretary.
That is,
Yes, her son was Evan Mackay, who was a very good piper,
okay.
who went to Hong Kong and joined the Hong Kong police. But so Dolina was a dear, dear woman, a very lovely woman, very motherly, so kind of maternal, beautiful face, and beautiful woman. And anyway, so I still have my membership card.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little folding book. And when you open it up, there's a picture of John McDougall Gillis standing there with his pipes.
Nice.
So that was it. I joined the SPA and proceeded to go every Saturday night I could go. I don't think I missed a night.
Yeah.
And so my pal then was John McCaskill. We were very good friends. And I'd be playing pipes at John's house to his father, Alec McCaskill, and his mother, Lexi McCaskill. Are you getting the picture?
Yeah, yeah.
These are all good friends. And John and I would play for his father. John was a medical student. There's too much to tell. So I'll just say maybe someday we'll get to talk about some of the more of this. But we would play for his father, both of us, and then we'd go to the Highlanders Institute. John would go downstairs to the dances, and I would go upstairs to the piping club. So my social life was very one-sided. It was all piping.
Right, right.
John was much more well-rounded.
Okay.
But anyway, the thing was that there were pipers at every stage. There were some of the most accomplished pipers in the piping world, and there's a long litany of them. But there'd be kids who had just learned their first tune on the pipes, and they were welcome to come up and play, and they were supported by the people there. But over time, I heard Ronald Laurie regularly. He was a regular to come there. A guy called Dougal Ferguson, who was a pupil of Donald McLeod's, a very good player. His daughter was Fiona Ferguson.
Okay.
That's a hornpipe that Donald wrote. And there would be Peter McLeod Jr. He's the guy who wrote Balachio. He was a virtuoso as a young guy. John McClellan, John McClellan from the Castle would play. Donald McLeod, Duncan Johnson would play quite often. There were other McFadgens who were not directly related to John. One was Hector McFadgen from Penny Gale. He was a great player. There was a guy, Archie McPhail. He's the guy that wrote Lachlan of Tyree. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And it just went on and on. So at the end of the season, one year they decided to have a series of knockout competitions, and they would invite 4 pipers to play. It would be 2 and 2, and so each piper was encouraged to do a half-hour program of whatever they wanted. And after they played, the judges would be hidden in the audience, and the audience would vote and the judges would vote. And the person who got the most votes would go on to the next round. So these players were incredible. Jimmy Young was playing, James McGregor was playing, Donald McLeod, of course, Duncan Johnson. And so they'd start with 4, and then 2 would go forward to the next round. And every time Donald McLeod showed up to play, he would play something we'd never heard before that he had composed.
Okay.
And every time Duncan Johnson showed up, he would play something that we'd never heard before.
Okay.
It was like a instant hit. It was
Nice.
like an instant hit. For example, with Wee Donald, I heard The Man from Skye, his first public airing of that. heard, what's some of the other ones that he composed that were so good? Oh
I
my
heard-
goodness.
I heard there was one time mentioned that that he might have even had composed a tune on the fly while he's, yeah.
That happened at the Northern meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. This series of knockouts came down to two people at the end of the season. We're now into like May because it'll stop for the Highland Games. So the final round was Duncan Johnson and Donald McLeod. And you could not have squeezed another person into that room with a shoehorn.
Really?
It
Yeah.
was a one giant mosh pit of piping enthusiasts.
Right.
And all I can tell you is the playing was just absolutely over the top. I can't even remember who won. I can't remember. One of the two
They were
of them
both
won.
just so good, I guess.
Well, the audience was totally enthralled.
Yeah.
But the Inverness story is apparently they had I'd never heard of such a thing, but they had a hornpipe competition in Inverness. And the players had to submit, I don't know, several tunes. And Donald McLeod had this idea of this tune called Dr. John McInnes's Fancy.
Okay.
And so he went up to the table and they were going to tell him what his tune was. And they said, well, Donald, we'd love to hear John McInnes's Fancy. And so apparently he only had like 2 parts composed.
Oh, really?
So he did the third and fourth on the stage. And
Really?
I believe he won the competition.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, he was something else. He was absolutely charismatic when he was performing.
Mhm.
That's why I wish there had been a video of him doing some of that kind of playing.
Yeah.
You know, but that was long before. I mean, even a 8mm film, because the fluidity of his performance was absolutely unbelievable. It was a lesson in itself just to
Right.
watch him perform.
Yeah. I could only imagine.
He had a very flat high A. To our ears today would say, gee, that high A is awfully flat. But once he started playing, you didn't notice it. The playing was so good, you didn't care.
Right. Yeah, I could only imagine. So what do you think, to get to such a high level? And I mean, you've accomplished a lot in your own right. I mean, you were basically one of the first people in the Americas, if you will, to have won some of the highest awards in Scotland. I mean, what do you think it takes to get to such a high level of, an ability to just play without mistakes? What do you think a person has to commit to?
Another very good question. I'll try to summarize my thoughts. First off, the notion of someone from the United States of America going to Scotland and walking out of Scotland with a major award was totally unheard of. And I think there's a reason for that. I think the reason was that it goes down to the concept of the ugly American. During perhaps the First World War, but absolutely Second World War, Americans made incredible sacrifices as part of the Allies to overcome Hitler's nightmare. And nothing but praise can be given to the people that did that. But unfortunately, something went along with it. It was a real cocky attitude in the midst of a lot of people that had been bombed, lost family members, and were up against pretty tough financial times. And in the midst of that, American GIs went over with comparatively healthy wallets and were throwing a lot of money around. And doing things that they couldn't do. And there was a resentment from that. It was a resentment of making them feel worse because they were up against it so much, they being British people.
Yeah.
So that was residual for a long time. There's still some of that left. So American piper going to Scotland and setting sights on getting to be a better piper and setting sights on trying to go for the golden fleece, as it were. Something for which I am grateful is that my father and every one of my teachers taught me modesty and humility, and not to present myself with a big ego. That was made very plain to me from the time I was a pretty young child. As it was, I was pretty shy as a kid. I was a pretty shy person. Okay. But I went to it with that attitude, and I went there with absolute respect and reverence for pipers that were tremendous musicians. And that's where everything began. That's how my pathway to trying to achieve those things began, with great modesty and great respect for the people that were there. And I worked, I didn't consider it work. I practiced hard because I loved it so much. And then I went about and I went to playing places, and a lot of the Scottish guys would lean in and offer me advice and help me, because I wasn't coming across with a big attitude. So after a while, I became accepted as just one of them, because I didn't try to put myself above them in any way, shape, or form, and they got that. So the first rule from my perspective is genuine humility, not just play humility, genuine modesty and humility, which I soon discovered is how all the great pipers in Scotland behave. The really great ones don't go around with an attitude. I can give you two shining examples, Willie McCallum and Stuart Little. I've never heard Stuart brag about himself, ever. I've never heard Willie brag about himself. Unfortunately, there are some North Americans that pull on to this attitude of, I'm so important. And that doesn't go down well in Scotland or Ireland. So I think that's the number one thing, is understand the meaning of modesty and begin there. And then the next point is keep your eyes and ears open, and then evaluate the information that's coming in. Is this the real thing, or is this maybe a side piece of information? That's what ultimately, I am very grateful to every teacher I've ever had in piping. They've all been tremendous teachers, every one of them. But the path that led me to Bob Brown and Bob Nickel, when I was able to get tuition from them, it was the difference between a shallow well and a very deep well. Here's another thing that came from those teachers. They never put any limits on what I could ask. And to the best of their ability, they would answer a question as fully as they possibly could. In other words, they held nothing back, and they were eager to share what they knew. And then the third thing, so number one, humility. Number two, if you're sincerely interested, you will find the well that has the water.
Okay.
And the third thing is the learning never stops. That's what those teachers taught me. To Bob Brown's last day, I dare say, he was still learning. He traveled light years beyond the normal piper, but he was still learning. So that's the third thing. Number one, humility. Number two, find a well. Number three, a deep well. And number three, the learning, if the learning stops, here's what Bob Brown said to me about that. He said, when I think I know all there is to know about piping, I will give up that hobby and take up another hobby. And he never gave up that hobby.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, that's it. That's the story. And so when I'm working with piping students, I feel it's very important that they grasp the concept of modesty. It bothers me to see occasionally people who've got such big egos that, the old story. If a head's too full of too much information, there's no room for anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That goes way back to our little chat about Bob Nickel going to John McDonald.
Right.
There's one more story about that. This is also recorded in some of the archives. Bob Brown talks about his first experience. He's now alongside a nickel, and they're both getting lessons. And this is a loose paraphrase. He said, yes, he would tell you all the stories about the tunes, and it'd be awfully, it was a fascinating, and it'd be very, very pleasant. And then he'd say, well, this is wasting time. Get out your pipes now and play. and then Brown would say, and then he'd get out his pipes and he would play. And he said, I remember I felt like I could walk through a closed door with a tile hat on my head. Tile hat would probably be one of those hats that people wear at graduation.
Okay, right.
He felt so small that you wouldn't have to open the door. He could just walk underneath.
Right. That's funny.
Back to the modesty thing again.
Right. I was also very struck when you were talking about in your interview with The Voice about learning from Seamus McNeil. And you said that he was very, very strict with his piping. He would even kind of put the order of the pipers, how they performed that day. And you said even yourself, oftentimes you were in last place.
Yes.
It was, and I guess you kind of had to deal with that. And that would probably be considered very different today, at least here in America. Sometimes people kind of joke about it. They call it like a participation trophy. Like even if you come in last place, you're still a winner. So you might kind of describe that system as kind of very rigorous.
Yes.
Do you think that was something that was very commonplace back then all over?
Okay, this is another very good question. I just want to insert one thing to say that the person who did those interviews for The Voice was Paula Glendenning.
Okay.
And she was the person who was helping Paula put it all together with graphics and so on, most likely was Charlie Glendenning. And Paula definitely was experienced a lot of what was in that article. She was a devoted pupil at Invermark, as was Charlie. And anyway, that was typical of her, and that was typical of the two of them in The Voice magazine. They did many, many in-depth interviews, and they were done really well. I just want to acknowledge that. It's so important to do that. But onto the Seamus thing. So back then, one of the things that's happened with piping from my beginning days to the present time is that it's like a camera lens that has gone from being partially focused to down to fine pixelation of precision. That's what's happened to the understanding about high quality piping. So when I went to Seamus, I went there because I had learned a lot from the tutor book that he and Thomas Pearson did.
Mhm.
And I was quite excited to be able to study with him. And it turned out that that the way it worked is I went for I don't know how long the program was. I'm going to guess it was 3 weeks. I'm not sure, but I think it was 3 weeks.
Okay.
And the first week you studied with Seamus's pupils, and they were pretty tough. And I really was stunned at how many faults I had.
Mhm.
But that was good because it sort of helped me get better for when I studied with Seamus. And then the way it worked with Seamus is the boys that were at a certain level, the 12 of us, we all sat as a class, and we literally sat on a form like they used in churches, 12 of us. And he would sit on a slightly raised platform behind a table. He always wore his kilt. In fact, it was at the Gaelic College in Cape Breton. And at that time, all the boys wore their kilts all the time.
Mhm.
And consider that Seamus was head of the Department of Physics at Glasgow University at that time. So he was quite comfortable standing in front of a group and presenting.
Mhm.
He was also known for being a good lecturer. My friend John McCaskill was doing his pre-med stuff with Seamus, his physics, and he was known to be a totally engaging lecturer, and it's true. He had a real gift for drawing focus when he was presenting a subject. So we would have a tune or a couple parts of a tune. He'd play them over to us, and then we'd have to sight read and play for him. And he was extremely exacting about clarity of fingering, cleanliness of grace notes, precision of doublings. He didn't press the timing issue as much, but he was very, very strict about clean fingering.
Mhm.
So much so that in retrospect, I look back and we were taught to recognize a crossing noise.
Mhm.
And God forbid anybody should make a crossing noise while playing for him. There'd be an electrical charge that would go through everybody, and we'd lift up off the bench and start shaking if anybody made a crossing.
Right.
So I mean, he really got that message through.
Right.
And a lot of my current friends were students of Seamus's, and he was famous for making all the girls cry. He was known for doing that.
That's funny.
They'd all be in tears. The boys had to suck it up. That's the way it was back then. You might have wished that you could cry, but that wasn't permitted.
Right.
You had to man up,
Right.
and take it. You just had to take it. And at the end of the class, that somewhere about midday, he would have a graph paper thing up and all the names and then the grades for the day. And there were two of us that were consistently low on the totem pole. There was myself and a fellow by the name of Donald Groom. Donald Groom came from Prince Edward Island. He lived in Summerside, and his family owned the only hotel in town.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that the two dummies in the class, one of them was involved in starting the Invermark College of Piping, and the other one was the starter of the Summerside the College of Piping Summerside, PEI.
Okay.
That was Donald Groom. The two dummies are the guys.
Right.
Yeah. So
So you caught
and
up.
then- what?
I said you caught up.
Well, I was very motivated.
Yeah.
I was very motivated.
And
Now, the genius in the class
uh-huh.
was a guy called Sandy Gordon. I have to tell you about Sandy Gordon. Sandy Gordon was a minister's son,
Mm-hmm.
and as such, obviously had to present himself in a neat, clean, tidy manner at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of the boys lived in rough cabins. The girls lived up on the hill with matrons, and they had showers. They had very, very nice accommodation. The boys didn't have any running water. We had no showers.
Right.
We slept in bunks. If we wanted to bathe, we were directed to go down to the ocean and jump in. The temperature of the ocean was 29.5 degrees Fahrenheit.
So it was like almost like being with the McCrimmons.
Exactly correct. Our experience was very parallel to the McCrimmons.
Nice.
And Seamus, who probably weighed 94 pounds and was about 6 feet tall, used to jump in with his Speedo, and he would do backstrokes in a great big circle for like a 1/4 mile circle, while the rest of us were in the shoreline just getting one toe in the water.
Right.
Because he was used to the cold water of Scotland.
Yeah.
So that's that. It was pretty rough going in that regard,
I
but we had a lot of fun.
We see like this theme appearing where, you know, there was a lot of hardship, and the teaching in this case was kind of strict. I mean, do you think that says something about, you know, our own time? I mean, do you think we're being too easy, or maybe even in regards to pipe teaching? Or
That's a very good question. First off, I think that the modern piping student is capable of, when that person chooses to do it, is capable of fabulous concentration, focus. I'm working with a number of students right now who are kind of amazing in regard to their desire and will to learn.
so you think it's more of a matter of what you were saying before. It's a matter of, if there's a well there, you know, you want to, if the person wants to draw from it, where a lot of that will come from, and not so much a rigorous system that, you know, is going to kind of make these soldiers of piping.
Yeah, these views that you're presenting right now are fascinating views, and I think they have great merit, and I think there's a lot of insight going on here. I said to you earlier, I mentioned the term apprenticeship. If we talk about a lot of the early eras of piping, to learn to play the pipes was an apprenticeship. It was conducted like an apprenticeship, and it meant kind of grim adherence to rigorous practice routines. If I remember correctly, my first teacher was given 18 months of exercises before he's allowed to play a tune. And Bob Brown the same, and both of them had the same thing. They said, and I was going to my last lesson to tell my teacher that I didn't want to do this anymore. And in the case of Brown, he put this tune in front of them. The teacher just stuck this on the table. Sight read it, his first tune. He was ready to chuck it.
Okay.
Same with my first teacher, 18 months of exercises. That's apprenticeship type training. You've got to learn how to use these tools. You've got to get it perfect. Then we'll talk about making something. So that's the mentality that was extant at that time. And there's some really great, John Wilson and emigrated from Edinburgh to Toronto. There are two John Wilsons, the current one in Glasgow, but this is earlier. He seemed to have taught that way. Gail Brown was one of his students, and Glenn Brown is one of her students. And all the people I mentioned have very, 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 very good technique. And the two drummers, Gail's sons, same story in drumming, immaculate technique. So that certainly was a disciplined approach that got them at a very superior technical level, all of them. Then the other thing is the yelling pipe major syndrome. Where did that come from? Remember, we were talking about a lot of pipers served in the regiments. That's the way regimental bands were handled. It wasn't like let's have a heart to heart. It's like people were yelled at, given orders. You must do this. Do it now. Now these guys leave the military and they're doing a civilian pipe band. Guess what? The same. They don't know any other way to communicate but to yell at people,
right?
And to ridicule people and all the rest of it.
Okay. So
now let's take another leap forward. Let's go to Terry Lee. Let's go to Stuart Little, who played a long time in Terry Lee's band. And to the best of my knowledge, Richard Parks and Rob Matheson. And Terry Tully and Alan Tully. I have a feeling these guys are not into in fact, I heard a program done in Glasgow, a little session put on by Terry Tully to talk about Irish piping in Ireland. And when the program was over, the dad of one of the kids in the band got up and said, as far as we know, Terry Tully has never yelled at any band practice ever. So that's got to be the new pipe band. That's got to be the new way of making pipe band scenarios into more of professional musicians, learning what they have to learn, preparing what they have to prepare, and then having a leader who helps them put it all together in a good way. So to me, in this conversation today, we've talked about the early origins of Highland warriors going into a regiment and playing bagpipes.
Yeah.
And then we've talked about the long pathway to improving the quality of the musicianship. And then we've talked about the civilian follow-up in police and colliery bands. And now we're talking about 2021. So the old stories are ones of stern apprenticeships and stern disciplinary behavior and military style leadership. And now we're talking about musical ensembles. I think that is a pretty representative overview of where all that's gone. And when it comes to the solo piping, the materials are available for a piper to do self-study. My only concern is for those same people to become acquainted with the origins of the music, become acquainted with the culture of the people who created the music, and to make a bit of a study of that and see how the two things relate to one another. And when that happens, that's when I believe we will perhaps be able to see the highest evolution of piping there has ever been in the history of the world.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very informative answer because, you know, one of the questions I was trying to get at today was like, what do you think, you know, is one of the greatest dangers in piping today? And you really kind of nailed that down, that it's not just, you know, learning the music in itself, but it's really extending that to connecting with the culture and making sure that the person is aware of this culture and the language, its richness and its history. So I greatly appreciate that. And I really do think that that was one of the things that, you know, I wanted to achieve with this interview. And I really do appreciate you, you know, elaborating upon that.
Well, you set up a great format, and thanks for doing that.
Thank
And
you,
you thought
Donald.
out
I mean,
those-
you were very gracious with your time and being able to share this with us. And I think that, you know, in conclusion, because you were very, we definitely, we went over 3 hours, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton of people who love viewing this content on the internet. And I would love for us to do a follow-up, a part 2, because there's definitely a lot of other stuff I think we can cover. But this was really wonderful because I think we really kind of touched upon a lot of aspects of teaching and learning and some of the experiences you had. So I'm extremely grateful for you for doing this.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for asking me. I'm very glad that we were able to do this, and I'll stand by for future occasions.
That's awesome. And I'm definitely going to refer people to your website so they can find out more about you, to the interview that I had aforementioned with the voice. And I would strongly encourage anybody who's watching this, whether or not they are practicing on the bagpipes or they're learning, even if they're not, to book some time with you to just even talk, because you know you've had so much great information, and you have so much stuff to share. So if anybody wants to book some time with you, I would strongly encourage everyone to go to donaldlindsay.info, right? If I'm not,
I believe that's
mistaken.
correct. Yes.
Yeah, it's .info to your personal website to learn more about you. And you also have had recordings that you've released. I got to listen to your last recording. If I'm not mistaken, it is Valley of the.
It's the waters of the North Esk.
Yeah, that was a great recording to listen to. I encourage everyone to listen to it and to support it by purchasing the recording. And yeah, definitely. Obviously, anybody who's listened today learned a lot. And I would encourage anybody to learn more about you and to also support you as an artist and in any way. And if they want to learn more directly from you. But again, thank you so much for doing this. It was awesome.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, I would just say too, you know, hopefully stay tuned, and we will do a follow-up interview with more questions that you can answer.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And yeah, until next time.
Bye for now, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.